Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.4, Recovering Ancient Israel. Welcome back to the History in the Bible podcast. Last time we left the study of the Bible with Johann Semler, who had begun a critical re-examination of the entire biblical canon in the late Enlightenment. As he wrote, natural philosophers were conducting the first experiments and investigations into chemistry and geology. These people would later be called scientists. Antoine Lavoisier, Henry Cavendish, Joseph Priestley and others devised the theories and quantitative methodologies that would be the bedrock upon which the modern world was built. The Scottish geologist James Hutton decided that the rock formations he studied could not possibly have been formed in a short period of time by means of a catastrophe such as the Great Flood. They had been made by processes still happening on the Earth in the present day. As these processes were very gradual, the Earth needed to be ancient to allow time for the changes. His scientific successors in the early 19th century developed his work. By the 1830s, natural philosophers generally accepted that the Earth must be much older than the Bible said. But in that chronology, the chronology of humans was still moot. The universe could well have been created many thousands, if not millions of years before God made Adam and Eve. In the 1820s, the French archaeologist Paul Tournal scrimmaged amongst ancient cave floors and found human bones and teeth mixed with crude pottery and the bones of extinct and modern animals. Until then, the orthodox view was that those old bones and tools were Celtic or Gallo-Roman. Tournal emphasised the geological evidence to the point that he broke the tradition of linking ancient cave deposits with the flood. He was the first to link geology and history, and the first to use the word prehistoric. It is worth remembering just how little was known about the ancient Middle East when Johann Semler wrote in the late Enlightenment. Mesopotamia had enjoyed a 2,500-year literary tradition, with another 1,000 years encoded in myth and oral culture. Much of this passed down into the literature of adjoining regions. The tradition included historical documents such as king lists, chronicles, annals, epic poems, and lamentations. Accumulated from 3rd millennium beginnings, these were repeatedly copied as part of the training of scribes and disseminated through libraries. The ancient languages of this tradition, Akkadian and Sumerian, were eventually lost. Their last speakers died in the century or two before the turn of the Common Era, as far as we can tell. Only fragments of the ancient texts survived in history, written by a Babylonian priest called Berosus. He wrote his work around 300 BC for the successors to Alexander the Great. His history was not popular, and now only survives as fragments quoted by later classical authors. Knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphics survived another few centuries, but it too was lost by the time the Roman Empire was Christianized. In the West, the history of Mesopotamia and the Levant was only preserved in the Bible. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles and Nehemiah recounted the fortunes of the two kingdoms and their relations with the kingdoms to the north and the great empires of Assyria, Babylon and Persia. Isaiah and other prophets left vivid descriptions of the gathering threat of imperial conquest. In Mesopotamia itself, we can only presume that the ancient histories were preserved in some form by the various overlords of the Twin Rivers. But these were all lost with the Arab conquests. The only way to recover the ancient and vast literature of the Middle East was for someone to go there and dig it up. No one in the Ottoman Empire was inclined to undertake the arduous task, so that left it to the Europeans, for right or wrong. The first to do so was Carsten Niebuhr. Niebuhr was the sole survivor of an expedition financed by the King of Denmark. In his Descriptions of Travels in Arabia, published in 1778, he entranced Europe with his descriptions of the architecture of ancient Persia. He excited scholars with his transcriptions of the many monumental texts he found. Niebuhr identified 3 different languages from his descriptions, although he had no idea what they meant. When Napoleon invaded Egypt 20 years later, he invaded with 40,000 soldiers and 167 savants, each and every one fired with an Enlightenment thirst for knowledge, engineers, artists, mathematicians, chemists, geologists and botanists, the greatest scientific expedition in history to that time. When the savants returned to Europe with their drawings and diaries, they caused a sensation. When the British retook Egypt, they came back with a Rosetta Stone, an inscription in 3 languages, Greek and 2 types of Egyptian. In 1822, Jean-Francois Champollion used it to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphic text. It was the first great breakthrough in understanding the ancient past. While Champollion was poring over the Rosetta Stone, the French Vicar General of Baghdad carried out the first excavation of a Mesopotamian site. The glazed brickworks and tablets he shipped home excited the public imagination. This imagination was further stoked by the publication of Travels in Syria and the Holy Land in 1822 by the intrepid Swiss traveller Johann Burckhardt. Burckhardt had spent years in the Middle East disguised as an Arab merchant. His descriptions of the exotic Orient stimulated an entire tourist industry for rich Westerners. The archaeology of the Middle East really starts with Paul-Émile Bottard, the French consul in the Iraqi city of Mosul. In 1843 he stumbled upon the palace of the Assyrian king Sargon II, uncovering richly ornamented alabaster wall reliefs. He thought he had found Nineveh, the great capital of Assyria described in the Bible. Nineveh it was not, but the French government was so impressed by his finds that they financed his excavations and were rewarded with a magnificent shipment of sculptures and inscriptions. You can visit them in the Louvre, which opened its Assyrian gallery in 1847. Alas, ill health and political disgrace forced Bottard's early retirement. The initiative passed to Bottard's friend, Austrian Henry Layard, a minor British diplomat in Constantinople. The British were not to be outdone by the French. Layard had no difficulty in convincing the British government to expropriate for the British Museum that which Bottard had taken for the Louvre. In 6 years, Layard shipped home a vast quantity of monumental statuary and stone wall reliefs. He had discovered the old Assyrian capitals of Nimrud and Nineveh, until then only biblical legends. His 1849 book Nineveh and its Remains outsold everything except cookbooks at the railway station bookshops. By our standards, the excavation methods of Bottard and Layard were primitive to the point of wanton vandalism. They knew no better, for no better had been devised. But in less than a decade they had resurrected from obscurity the mighty Assyrian Empire, previously only known from the Bible. Much more was to come. As the Rosetta Stone was the key that helped decipher hieroglyphics, so the mighty Behistun inscription was the key to cracking cuneiform. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, cuneiform was not a single system of writing for one language. It was used for numerous languages over 3,000 years. The Behistun inscription was a huge carved work, more than 300 square metres, commanded by the Persian king Darius I, he who was defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. In 3 languages and 3 different cuneiform scripts, Darius defended his accession to the throne for all the world to see. In the late 1700s, Carsten Niebuhr had already speculated that one language was Old Persian, written in an alphabetic form of cuneiform. It became clear that the other inscriptions contained formulaic repetitions of royal titles, which could be used to determine the phonetic values of some of the signs. By 1840, the Old Persian script had been deciphered, opening the way to understanding the most important language on the inscription, Akkadian, the language of Assyria and Babylon. Akkadian was not only the language of 2 great empires, but, as we now know, the lingua franca of the whole Middle East from about 1400 BC to 800 BC. If you wanted to trade or deal with foreigners in any way, you used Akkadian. When Abraham and later Jacob went to Egypt, they would have conversed with their hosts in Akkadian. After years of work, the final decipherments were taken by Sir Henry Creswick Rawlinson. By 1857, the Akkadian language was cracked, and thousands of cuneiform tablets from dozens of cultures could now reveal their riddles. One of the great surprises from the archaeological discoveries of the second half of the 19th century was the uncovering of a great empire, that of the Hittites. We now know that the Hittites had vied with Egypt for centuries to control the Levant. The Hittites were mentioned many times in the Bible, along with the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and a whole host of nations. They were all taken to be petty neighbours of Israel. Writing in 1853, Francis William Newman, the younger brother of Cardinal Newman, said, "No Hittite kings can have compared in power to the king of Judah." That idea was spectacularly shattered with the discovery of the Amarna diplomatic letters in the 1880s. These letters have proved uniquely valuable. The city of Amarna was founded by Egypt's oddest king, Akhenaten, as his new capital around 1350 BC. If you believe the traditional Jewish chronology, this is a century after the Exodus. If you believe the traditional Christian chronology, it is a century before. If you believe the archaeology, think of Amarna as flourishing 350 years before the time of King David. Akhenaten is the first monotheist who can be reliably dated. He wanted a brand new city where he could worship the sun in peace. The city was abandoned by his son, King Tut of legend, and not re-inhabited until Roman times. Because the city was inhabited for only a few decades, we can be very sure that all the finds there date from the same short period. And what finds they are! Hundreds of letters from Egypt's vassals in Canaan and the other great powers of the Near East, most written in Akkadian. Here writes Biladeer, ruler of the large Canaanite city of Megiddo, angsting about Labiu, ruler of Shechem. As I'll discuss in later episodes, Shechem was later venerated by the Israelites as a holy place, sanctified by Abraham, Joseph, and Joshua. It would become the capital of the breakaway kingdom of Israel. Quote from Biladeer: "To the king, my lord and my God and son, thus speaks Biladeer, the loyal servant of the king. At the feet of the king, my lord and my God and my son, 7 times and 7 times I prostrate myself. May the king know that since the archers have gone back, Labiu carries out acts of hostility against me, and that we cannot shear the wool, and that we cannot pass through the gate in the presence of Labiu, since he knows that you have not given me archers. And now he intends to take Megiddo, but the king will protect his city so that Labiu does not seize her. In truth, the city is destroyed by death as a result of pestilence and disease. Grant the king 100 garrison troops to guard the city, lest Labiu take it. Certainly Labiu has no other intentions. He tries to destroy Megiddo." Many of the Canaanite vassals protested their loyalty in the face of Hittite aggression. From the sheer number of complaints, it became clear that the Hittites were a major power, a rival to Egypt, not some petty kingdom. Many of the Amarna tablets were written in a language unknown to the archaeologists of the 1880s. Excavations in Turkey in the early 20th century produced thousands of tablets in the same unknown language. Both the language, Hittite, and the history of its people were unravelled by 1920. Only then did we come to realise that the Hittites had been a world power located in modern Turkey for 300 years. Before I continue with the story of Palestinian archaeology specifically, let me describe the land. Our stage is the land of Canaan, or Palestine, or the Holy Land. Call it what you will. And what a small stage it is, bounded to the north by the foothills of the Lebanon and the Anti-Lebanon mountains, to the south by the Sinai Desert, and to the east by the Arabian Desert. An area about the size of the American state of New Jersey, half the size of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, 1/3 the size of the Australian state of Tasmania, 1/4 the size of Scotland. That should be enough international comparisons. Canaan's varied landscape, framed by sea and desert, by Egypt and Anatolia, part badlands, part green plains, never really encouraged nationhood. The heart of Canaan was the Central Highlands, a strip about 30 kilometres wide and 200 kilometres long that adjoined the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. It was a hard place to survive. Canaan was bounded by 2 ancient roads, highways connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia. To the east, skirting the desert, the King's Highway ran from Damascus to the Gulf of Aqaba, one of the 2 gulfs bordering the triangle that is the Sinai Desert. Along the coast, the Way of Horus ran from the Nile Delta along the northern Sinai to the port cities of Gaza and Ashkelon in Canaan's Mediterranean plain. The donkey trains brought perfumes, lapis lazuli and precious stones from the Fertile Crescent, and returned building stone and cedar logs. From Arabia came metals, from the Dead Sea bitumen, from the Mediterranean salted fish. The villagers of the highlands traded in pottery, honey, leather goods, dyeing and woven wares. When times were good and the rains came, the highlands were the mixing pot where the nomads of the desert, met the traders from the cities on the plains. The nomads needed the marketplace of settled villages in order to obtain grain and other agriculture. The farmers depended on the nomads for a regular supply of meat, dairy products and hides. Long after Mesopotamia was being dug up by every European who could get a museum grant, the land of Palestine was still territory untouched by archaeology. I really want to emphasise that. The archaeological investigation of Palestine dates only to the very late 19th century. The monuments of Canaan were less impressive than those of Mesopotamia and Egypt. There were no imperial languages to decipher. Early excavations in Jerusalem excited local Jewish opposition and scandal in Europe. To this day, archaeologists in Israel face the same sort of objections. Serious work only began with Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. He held the first chair of Egyptology in the United Kingdom and excavated many of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt over some 40 years. In the 1890s, he directed his attentions to the Middle East and commenced the first major excavations ever undertaken in Palestine. He brought a passion for meticulous observation and recording. Until Petrie, archaeology had been a haphazard free-for-all of treasure hunting. Every adventurer looked for the next grand statue or splendid inscription. Petrie insisted that history was to be found in systematically uncovering layer after layer, looking for the details. And key to those details were pottery fragments, not mighty sculptures. The Middle East is dotted with hills that contain the remains of towns and cities. They are called tells. They rise as cities are destroyed or abandoned, then levelled, then rebuilt. This cycle could repeat for centuries. Changes in occupation levels may be marked by evidence of destruction, such as thick layers of ash, or by indications of a fresh start on the site, such as a deep fill. Petrie invented what we now call seriation, the way to give chronological order to the mass of excavated finds found at the tells. Petrie matched the many layers he found at different sites by comparing the different types of pottery found at each layer. He assumed that each pottery style had a life before it was superseded by a different pottery type. He could therefore date each site relative to another, but he could not provide absolute dates for any. Archaeological method has been greatly refined since Petrie's day, and many of Petrie's conclusions have been challenged and corrected. But Petrie's methodology was the first and by far the largest step in getting it right. He had shown how scientific method and not wanton looting could bring ancient Canaan into the light. Until the 1920s, every archaeological expedition that worked in Palestine followed Flinders Petrie in labelling their excavated strata with vague names like Amorite or Semitic, names that reflected the excavator's own interpretations of ancient history. This created many confusions in biblical archaeology. In 1922, a meeting of scholars in the offices of the Department of Antiquities of the British Mandate in Palestine agreed to use a new system of classification. The meeting was chaired by the British archaeologist John Garstang, a pupil of Flinders Petrie. Garstang turned to the theories of an obscure curator of the National Museum of Denmark, Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, dead for 60 years. Early in the 19th century, Thomsen had brought order to his beloved collections by organising groups of finds according to the materials used for their cutting tools: stone, bronze, iron. That idea was not new, but Thomsen's idea of association was. Thomsen considered the cutting tools not on their own, but in relation to what was found with them. Working from this idea, he decided that, for example, pottery vessels were made in all three ages, but glass vessels only in the Iron Age. This made it possible to organise not only cutting tools, but all finds in the museum. Now the vast quantity of prehistoric time had a chronological dimension. John Garstang was also the first to conduct large-scale excavations in Palestine in the 1930s. He went looking for Jericho, the first city to fall to Joshua and the Israelites. As a good Christian, he knew that the Bible had quite firm ideas as to the date of the conquest. According to 1 Kings 6, 480 years elapsed between the Exodus and the 4th year of Solomon's reign, the year in which he began to build the temple. Garstang placed Solomon's 4th year at 967 BC. This suggested that the Exodus occurred around 1447 BC. The rabbis also dated the Exodus to this time. allowing for the 40-year wandering prior to the Israelites' invasion of Canaan, the initial stages of the conquest must therefore have occurred around 1407 BC. Garstang dug right down to the most ancient of Jericho's layers, which was clearly Stone Age. He identified 4 cities built on top of each other, separated by bands of burnt material. He was convinced that the final city was the one that Joshua had destroyed. This was a typical Bronze Age fortification, known from Egypt to Syria. Garstang was most interested in the walls, and especially the latest wall, the one that Joshua must have destroyed. The wall was a rough affair of loose stone and brick. It had been built on top of an earlier wall, showing the clear signs of haste that suggested the preparation for a siege. It showed frequent signs of disastrous collapse, bricks lying sprinkled at its foot. And all around the bottom of the wall was a broad band of ash, created by a fire so fierce that the sun-dried bricks had been fired as if by a kiln. Garstang could see that the wall's attackers had placed brushwood against it to burn it down. This was the first phase of a general attack upon the city, just as the Bible tells us. Garstang concluded that City 4 came to an end about 1400 BC. In a classic case of how archaeologists try to date sites and layers, he reasoned thus. First, he could not find any of a certain type of Greek pottery that flourished after 1400 BC. This pottery was found in many other sites in the Levant. Second, he argued from Egyptian chronology, which even in the 1930s was relatively well established. The Egyptian scarabs he found in tombs were made no later than the reign of Amenhotep III, who died around 1350 BC. Nor was Jericho mentioned in the massive Amarna letter archive, also dated to about 1350 BC. Garstang was jubilant. He had found Jericho, and what he had found confirmed the Bible's account. Quote, "In a word, in all material details and in date, the fall of Jericho took place as described in the biblical narrative. Our demonstration is limited, however, to material observations. The walls fell, shaken apparently by earthquake, and the city was destroyed by fire around 1400 BC. These are the basic facts resulting from our investigations. The link with Joshua and the Israelites is only circumstantial, but it seems to be solid and without a flaw." End quote. In the next episode, I'll continue the story of how the West began to recover the history of ancient Canaan.